We do a lot of work with different real estate groups. We do a lot of work with, obviously, municipalities and what municipalities need. And starting in 2018 would have been the first iteration. We started doing a survey that we would do yearly on youth. And previously it was the youth study. Now we've rebranded it as the Zennials. So obviously the Zennials, what this research is comprised of is our millennials and our Generation Z. And what's really fascinating about these groups is they have a very different perspective than the generations before, specifically the Gen X and the Boomers. And they are obviously a large cohort with overlapping perspectives and values, especially between the younger millennials and the Gen Z. So millennials, in one of our first presentations of this study back in 2019, we put the millennials on a spectrum. So there were actually 3 mini cohorts within the millennial cohort. So you had the older millennials, which I'm proud to admit that I am a geriatric millennial, and we were are the more cynical of the millennials. So we're a little bit more like the Gen X and the Boomers, our parents before us, than even we would maybe like to admit. But I think if anyone falls in that range where you were 1981 to 1990, you might feel that you're a little more cynical of the world, a little more cynical of the generations coming up behind us, specifically the Gen Z, and maybe even have a lot of differences that you note between the other millennials, so the younger millennials. So we have the middle millennial group, and we tend to think of them as more the turbulent millennials. They're a little bit more anxious. They are a little bit more unsure of what they want in life or where they're going to go or what the process is going to be for them or what the outlook's going to look like. And then we have the younger millennials, which are a little bit more like Gen Z. They're a little bit more easygoing, go with the flow, a little more carefree, if you will. And one thing that we find with the Gen Zs and the younger millennials is due to their upbringing with IT and with internet, they have a lot more access to information. And whether it's real information or misinformation, that's debatable. But it's given them a lot more of a varying perspective and opportunities to explore and understand and form different perspectives and values and opinions than perhaps the generations before them have had. So one thing we found out with the younger generations, and this has been going on since at the onset of the study, is they are an anxious generation, and they always have been, and I think that they always will be. Now, do we think that they are more anxious or depressed than the generations before them? That's really difficult to say. I think if we look at society and how we handle the topics of mental health, how much more open we are to discuss the challenges and some of the opportunities there are to more openly support those with mental health challenges, and opportunities to obviously discuss spaces in schools, spaces through work where people can feel safe to come forward with these issues that they may be having. I think that's what's maybe driving these really high numbers that you see here for anxiety and depression. Perhaps not so much that it's any different than the generations before. They're just more comfortable and have more of the support and opportunities to disclose than we have in the past. And we can see here we have a very small subset of alphas. So alphas in this study were 12 to 14-year-olds. So there was only 200 of them, which I just want to draw a note to. But you can already see here the 54% indicate they've had bouts of anxiety and 16% for depression. So those are pretty high numbers, given I understand it's a small sample size, but something that obviously they're following in trend, if not more so than the Zennials, millennials, and Gen Z. We see here that they're accessing supports, which is wonderful. We all know in the changing climate, I was just on U of A grounds on Tuesday, seeing the different supports that are available there from when I was a student, the safe spaces, the opportunities in program support. It's come a very, very long way, even in 15 to 20 years. And here we see that, the youth today are accessing supports among those who need them. And again, those are really good movements to see, and something I think we're going to see become more, or we're going to see the younger alphas follow suit in this trend as well. One thing that we've noticed with Generation Z specifically is their consumption behavior, specifically their consumption behavior when it comes to alcohol. So we know that there's been a change in the leisurely entertainment, if you will, landscape. We've seen it here in Edmonton as well. More mocktail bars coming up, more mocktail opportunities on menus. Businesses are catering to a changing palette, if you will, of what a younger generation considers to be recreational and fun when they are looking for recreational opportunities. So we see here that the 36% down there says that they have increased or stabilized their alcohol consumption. That means that the majority have decreased it or stopped drinking completely in some varying degree for the Generation Z. So what are they doing that's different? They're purchasing alcohol products with, alcohol-free. They're going to cannabis or cannabis-derived products, as well as other drugs that are coming up on the market. And just speaking to one, there's microdosing of mushrooms that is gaining popularity at the moment, specifically in BC. And there's just alternatives to alcohol now that are being more openly used, explored, developed than there ever has been in the past. So why this change? We asked those who indicated they had reduced or don't drink at all. Generally, it's to do with health reasons. So they want to be healthy, they want to feel better, they want to look better, they want to do better for their bodies. This follows a lot what we see with younger generations in the past in this research is they're a generation that wants to feel good and do good. And they want to associate themselves with brands, communities that do the same. So they understand what they value. They determine what they value from this vast access to information that they have at their fingertips. And they want to ensure that that's reflected in what they're doing in terms of purchasing, in terms of where they live. They just want to really ensure that they're being the best they can, not only for themselves, but for their community as well. So what do they think of the finances? So one thing, and I'll touch on it here, and then I'll go into the home ownership side, because obviously housing is a major point, a major issue in all of our provinces and in the country as a whole. But the majority of millennials, either one, are already a homeowner, married, or parent. Makes sense. They're a little bit older. And then we have a third or a quarter who have the ambitions to do either of those things. So that's the majority of this generation. They still, as I mentioned earlier, they are a little bit more like the boomers and the Gen X than we want to admit. They still have some of those stereotypical, traditional values and expectations for their life. Whereas we see the Gen Z, obviously they're not currently there. They're younger. We all understand the economic times that we're in, so they don't have those opportunities. But what's interesting is less than half have the ambition for those things. So it's the Gen Z coming up is really changing how we perceive their major milestone moments, particularly when it comes to education, when it comes to work, when it comes to obviously marriage and home ownership. They just have different perspectives of what they want out of life. And a lot of the time, they just frankly don't know what that is yet, because there's so much being thrown at them as possibilities that they're having a hard time differentiating between the different options and what they want for themselves moving forward. So again, as I mentioned, the younger millennials, some of them are more carefree, go with the flow, they're not going to commit to anything. We have the anxious that are more concerned about their future and what their future is going to bring. Are they able to bring children into this world if they can't even take care of themselves? That's one finding that we uncovered last year in this study. So we see it continue here. Just a lot of uncertainty about what they want in the end game, if you will, for their lives. This generation, right from the onset of this study, has always noted that they are the disadvantaged generation compared to the generations before. There is a lot of resentment towards older generations that youth feel have placed youth in the situation that they currently are. So one example of this, single-use plastic bylaw that came into effect here in the city of Edmonton. We did engagement work for the city on this. We spoke to different demographics of Edmontonians in different areas. And one topic that stood out to me, and we actually tested it in last year's study, is do you think that you're paying the consequences for the actions of the generations before you? And one young person that I spoke to at one of these engagements or in one of these groups that we did actually noted that, it's because the generations before us wanted the convenience of single-use plastics. It made their life better in the moment, and now we're here to clean up that mess and change our habits. And it's more difficult to unlearn something like a bad habit like that, or the dependence on something like single-use plastics, than it is to become used to using it, as the generations before would have started. So that was just an example of how they feel that something as simple as plastic bags and forks has created now yet another barrier for them, another change that they need to do, another challenge that they need to go through. And quite frankly, with having to pay extra if you need a paper bag or a reusable bag, it hits them again in their financials. So it hits them again in their pocketbook, even when they want to go buy groceries, that's already costing them over $100 at the tills for the basic necessities. So they've always felt that they're the disadvantaged generation. They don't believe they're going to have what their parents have, the way that they had it. Now, do they necessarily want it that way? Gen Z, apparently, obviously, you just saw, doesn't know. But even if they did, it's impacting that decision of whether they want to get married or have children. So another thing that we ask, obviously, is we want to know, how are you doing financially? We know that they're struggling. We know that they have negative perceptions of the economic climate, their own personal finances, what they're going to be able to do with their finances. And we see it reflected here in the 49% who indicate that they do live paycheck to paycheck. Probably not too surprising, especially at this point. But this has stayed consistent for us over the past few years, and I wouldn't say it's just a reflection of the current economic inflation situation that we're having now. This generation and these generations have been indicating so for a few years now. And frankly, when we had the COVID year that blipped everything, we thought maybe by now things would be getting better for this generation. At least I thought so anyway when I present findings in 2020 and 2021. And here we are in 2024, and they're still having the same problems and challenges that they expressed all those years ago. Now, they do have, I would argue, maybe a little bit different mentality of what they want to spend their money on. So you're living paycheck to paycheck. 20% don't see the point in saving for the future. They'd rather enjoy their money right now. Well, then you can say that's on you, that situation that you're on, quite frankly. But nearly half as well dip into their savings for personal enjoyment. So they may not fall directly solely in that 20%, but I think that's a pretty big number. And if you are an older millennial or a Gen X or a boomer, that would be quite contrary to what we grew up in valuing and understanding what to do with our money. And we see it with the Gen Z. Obviously, they're younger, but they're not homeowners. We see it in it's not an ambition of theirs necessarily to be so. So I think that they're having more flexibility and they're allowing themselves a little bit more freedom in what's important to them, and living more in the moment is more important for the younger generations than thinking too far down into the future. And I think that's something that translates into every type of interaction you can have with youth, whether it's them as a consumer, whether it's them as an employee, or if it's them, as a friend or family member. And we'll touch a little bit on the employment and through this as well, I'd like to note. But we still see here that 65% of them are spending their budget on what we would deem as essentials. So housing, food, some sort of savings, and then we get into the transportation, clothing, leisure, and travel. So they are budgeting, they are understanding the importance of the essentials. No, not necessarily any issues there, even if they are living paycheck to paycheck. But what do they do when it comes to their budget? So very few, 18%, stick to it and stay to it. I just presented at a couple U of A classes this week as well, and a lot of them were kind of nodding along to this, that it's, I have a budget, but do I follow it to a T? Do I care enough to follow it to a T? Probably not. That they don't have the financial anxiety perhaps the generations had before to save for the rainy day. Don't know how many times I heard that growing up. But they have a loose idea of what they want to do with their money and what they should do with it. And then they have a loose hold on themselves on what they spend it on and where and how strictly they follow it. But the majority of them do indicate that they will watch it to some varying degree. This is really interesting. So obviously this question came up. We started running the online shopping behaviors in 2020, obviously with the introduction with the whole COVID issues. This is not surprising to see. We thought 4 years ago that this would continue to increase. And quite frankly, I'm surprised that 3% say that they never shop online for anything. That's probably more surprising to me than nearly all of them doing it. And we can see how far reaching their online purchasing behaviors are. Everything from obviously products, things from travel agents, essentially non-existent. They can do everything themselves. Their banking, their news sources, everything is done online. Everything is at their fingertips. And it's really created a very unique shopping experience and essentially life management situation for the young today. They're also a generation that really distrusts traditional forms of anything. I think it was in our 2021 study, we learned that they have strong distrust in traditional media. They have strong distrust in financial institutions. And obviously they have strong distrust in governments. So, you know, having the opportunity to do all of this on their own and at their own fingertips obviously won't come as a surprise probably to anyone. Now for the employment. I only have the one slide about the employment that we found interesting to note for this year's study. Everyone here can probably remember the Great Resignation of 2021, where we had high turnover in all sectors, in all businesses. Youth were having our heads spinning in trying to keep up with what they wanted from an employer in an employment situation and how we can retain them, because it was so easy for them to get up and go with the introduction of remote work and go wherever they wanted to go. It took away, we were now no longer competing with just those employers in our own backyard, but we were competing with employers nationally and internationally, quite frankly, with the different opportunities that were available. That thankfully stabilized in 2022. So, you know, employers, we all kind of got on the bandwagon of flexible work. We made it a lot easier for us to attract and maintain and retain staff. We got on the board of DEI inclusion policies. We got on board with mental health supports. We heard the challenges of the youth and we were able to make changes to keep some retention over the years. And we've remained stable for the past 3 years in that regard in terms of youth indicating that they're not likely or likely to leave their job in the next year. This, you know, seems obviously more welcoming to an employer than it was in 2021. But the fact that it is steadily increasing is something that now coming into next year and the following year of this study, we'll want to watch to see if it continues, because that means that it's time that we look at to what we need to change to stop that increase and stop that increasing trend before we get to another Great Resignation situation. So one of the reasons that the U of A wanted us to come and present today was this study that we did with the National Post in June. So I just covered over what the millennials and youth were saying in our youth study, but we also did a study with 18 to 39-year-olds in June about what they think about their future. So here we see again that when you ask them, you know, compared to generations before, how do you think life is? They overwhelmingly feel it's harder. So we're not surprised by that. We've seen it for the past 5 years that this is how they feel, and no matter where we ask it, how we ask it, they're always going to go with the harder. We also see here that they are quite split in their home ownership ambitions, or how likely they think that they are to be a homeowner. So we all know the current housing situation that everywhere across Canada is currently facing, and knowing that the youth today coming up, who are going to be those that hold the power to purchase homes, really aren't sure if that's what they even want to do, and if that's going to be something that's going to be happening for them. We did find in here that only 27% currently own a home or condo. So we asked some perception questions, which I thought were interesting to share. Not all have to do with housing or purchasing, but we wanted to know their agreement on some of these statements. So they most strongly agreed that we should ensure immigrants and permanent residents coming into Canada share common Canadian values, such as respect for different minority groups. Here we see again 68%. The older generations had it easier than my generation. 58% agree that politicians are more interested in promoting and protecting interests of the older generations and the people in my life. Pretty cynical group. 54% previous generations are rigging the system for benefit and making it harder for my generation. At this point, I don't think there's anything the older generations can do to make youth today feel any different than they do. 50% agree that the government policies, such as decriminalization of street narcotics or providing safe supply of narcotics to individuals, are going too far regarding harm reduction around the usage of illegal drugs. 44% say that they support the government in new rules to regulate the web, podcasts, streaming, and social media to restrict offensive speech and online harms. Now, this is, again, coming from the generation that is the most tech-savvy of all generations, having grown up with it for essentially their entire lives, and that being their main source of news and information. So just some interesting notes to kind of further validate the cynicism that this generation has towards older generations, their current outlook, and again, the government. So as with any Canadian, not surprised to see, perhaps maybe surprised to see that it's not a larger proportion feel that government should be spending less, but they're fairly split, as we would like to say in our world, in terms of under wanting more spending by the government or less spending to support services into the future. One thing to note here is when I looked at this regionally, Alberta youth were the ones, now not significantly greater than any other province, but they were proportionately greater in feeling that there should be more spending compared to less spending. I think that's a reflection of our climate, what the opportunities are in Alberta, seeing the interprovincial migration to Alberta that is ongoing for the past 3 years, I'd say for sure. But definitely not too surprising there to see that they would like to see a little bit less spending. Now, whether they fully understand what that means when they said it, not 100% sure. But considering we did ask them if they understood the budget or reviewed the budget beforehand, and they had not, or were not aware. So we can also take that as sometimes they might be a little less educated or informed. And we can see that with the 16% indicating that they don't know. So again, a little bit more context in their perceptions. We did ask, it says here that there are 3 different points of view regarding the role Canadian politicians should play regarding diversity and racial equality in Canada. 29% indicated that politicians should actively encourage citizens to celebrate being Canadian by focusing more on things that unite us and less on diversity and race equality. 27% indicate that the politicians should actively encourage Canadians to celebrate our differences by a strong focus of programs designed around diversity and racial equality. So a little bit split there on which way to go. 25% was we as Canadians should be the ones responsible for promoting Canadian culture, including diversity and racial equality, not the politicians. So youth today are very proud, and they're proud in regards to however they identify and whatever they identify is important to them. And they feel very strongly on those things. So I think that's what's bringing some of the polarity here and some of the contradiction in which way government should go and what we should promote and what we should do and what communities should look like. Really, it has to be a little bit of everything, because youth today are a little bit of everything, and they vary, and it's going to change, and it can change daily depending on what they're seeing in the news or through their feeds. So youth today are very connected to their values, and they're very connected in turn to how they associate themselves and whom they associate themselves with. So it's on brands that they interact with, organizations, groups that they follow, support, movements that they will become a part of or promote, as well as their communities. So we've seen a change with this generation in terms of how they interact with their local communities that we perhaps haven't seen as much of in the Gen X and Boomer generations, in that they do a lot more of local support, local shops, farmers markets, thrift stores. Their consumer behaviors are very different than their parents and the Boomer generation, the Gen X and the Boomer generation before them. And again, could this be because they feel that they have to make up for the actions of the generations before that have put our climate and our world in a more dire state and situation than perhaps we've ever seen before? Very well likely could be. Could it be because it's a trendy thing to do? Very well could be. But whatever the reason is, it's the reality and it's what youth want. So it's really important when you are trying to attract youth for whatever reason that you ensure that you project some of the values that they could potentially value, because that's what's going to draw them in and keep them in and keep them involved with you in whatever capacity that may be. Finally, here we see that young adults are divided when it comes to the benefits of government's current immigration plan. So 34% indicated that it's generally good for Canada, but it's created some problems. I would venture to say that the problems that it's created is probably, what from their perspective is with employment or employment opportunities, and only 11% think that it's overall good for Canada. This is not a youth perspective per se, solely, because we see this in our national studies, in our federal tracking about what Canadians as a whole feel on the immigration plans of Canada. So this very much echoes what the rest of Canadians feel as well in this capacity. But again, just a little bit more context into how youth are feeling, how youth are thinking about their future, how youth are thinking about the communities around them and society around them, and kind of what they're looking for moving forward. So that is everything that I have for everyone today. All these studies are up on our website, including our youth. And if anyone has any questions, I welcome them at this time. Yeah. Alpha, maybe?
No, yeah. But that said, I totally agree with what you see with the numbers. I guess more of a comment rather than a question is when you say that
Zennials? Gen Z, yeah, I can barely even pronounce it half the time. So we'll just say Gen Z and millennial.
being frustrated with the older generations, I think it also comes from the mindset being that they're also a lot more confident in how things transpire as compared to the previous generation that were focusing more on saving because they want to create that foundation.
Mhm.
But I'd say that a bit of that has translated to the additional confidence to be okay with leaving a job or something like that.
Yeah.
In some sense. So it's a mindset shift that
Mhm.
I think plays a key role in this. Matter of fact, I've used the word like there's a sense of entitlement that you have. It's probably not the case for the older generation.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that. our very first year doing this study, so in 2019 when we presented it, 2018, we determined that youth today, so Gen X and boomers and generations before, their life projection and path was very linear. So it was finish high school, get a apprenticeship education or post-secondary, or just get into the job market and start working, start saving, start doing. Next step after that was get married, buy a house, have a family, set those kids up on that path. That was their life milestones. And that was just what was considered the norm. That was what was considered ideal. That was what was considered the expectations. Now we have these youth, and I would argue the older millennials, the geriatric millennials, aren't as on this path in the same way that the younger millennials and the Gen Z are, but they are on this like wave, and it's not even circle, it's just this path that is bumpy and pivots and moves and changes because of exactly that. They are confident enough to know that if I don't know what I want to do, it's okay to trial and error. It's okay to go into one stream, say for education or work. It doesn't work out. I'm not going to sit and suck it up and do it because I'm scared of not finding another work opportunity like the generations before were, or because I'm worried about having a pension after 35 years, if those even exist in half of the jobs anymore. And they're more exactly that. They're more confident. And I think that they're more confident to make those changes and pivots and turns because they have more access to what the opportunities are. Where generations before didn't have that. You only knew what was talked about around your dinner table. You only knew what was available in your own backyard by going to that post-secondary or whatever it may be, that shop down the road that you wanted to work at, because that was within your arm's reach. Now their arm's reach is endless. And that's access to information, while it is anxiety driving, it increases mental health issues, it can cause a lot of the turbulence and uncertainty that they have in their life. It also makes them so much stronger and prepared to take chances and try new things and get into different avenues that generations before just didn't have the opportunity to do. So they're finishing high school, they're traveling, they are going into one field, they are doing more certificates, diplomas, shorter education streams, micro-credentialing, so that they can get a little bit of everything and go and be this jack-of-all-trades toolbox to an employer and change their employer every 5 years if they want to, and it's not viewed negatively like it was before. So I know for myself, for example, very linear. Finished high school, did university, finished university, got a job, started at Leger in 2011 and haven't left. And had a house, have a family. Like, I'm very much like my parents. But now I look at resumes of the younger generations, and it used to be a flag to see someone changing jobs so frequently. Now I find myself asking, what else in that resume is maybe supporting why they're making that change? Do they have more education certificates? Is there a gap? Do they maybe go travel? Are they just confident to know this is not what I want and I'm moving on? So you're more open to have the conversations with them to figure out the reasons behind it. Whereas before, it was just seen as a red flag and someone moved on. They didn't care what the reason was because it just wasn't normal. It wasn't ideal. So youth today are really changing what even older generations view as normal or ideal. Because until you can actually sit and talk with them, you don't actually know the whole story. And I think they do a very, very good job at being confident, setting boundaries, knowing what they want for themselves. They may not know what they want in 10 years, but at this very exact moment, they know exactly what they want, and they're not willing to sacrifice or put up with perhaps less ideal situations that some of us maybe did put up in our earlier years of our career, as some of us in other colleagues and friends here in Edmonton, that we always talk about this professional anxiety that we had when we first started in our careers, that you just did whatever the hell you had to do and you didn't complain about it. And I really admire the youth today, the younger ones coming up that are able to better articulate when they feel they need to push back a little bit, because it's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have any research based on younger generations and their spending on experiences. We work in the design space, and what we try to improve is that aesthetics and experience matters. So that's what the younger generation is looking to spend their money on, is being in that cool place, being where other people are, being in an aesthetic public space, or this experience that other people around. And is that supported by anything? Or,
Yeah, I think we had a little bit on that. Was it last year's study or maybe the study before? I would argue that they do care about that. That is important. We see it in how quickly they, one, change careers. Two, when they do want to spend their money, they want to spend it on something that means something to them, is worth that extra spend. Millennials are different than Gen Z. Millennials are more, they will spend more kind of like on traditional outings, I'd say. They're probably a little bit more concerned about the spending too much for something, if you will, that they maybe, if it's cool as it is, they're a little bit more financially restrained or restrain themselves. But Gen Z definitely, I think, are open to the opportunities and the experiences, but it's really important for them to feel that it is something that they like agree with, or that they value, or that is a reflection of themselves. But I think we see it here in Edmonton with like all the different types of pubs and stores and shops and little local, uniquely local opportunities for leisurely entertainment and spending. And I would say that a lot of that is driven by the youth. Because while they're not putting money towards traditional things like a home and mortgage, they are willing to dip into their savings to have that experience, or try something new, or go on a trip, or do something that's outside of the norm. So not quite 100% what you were going after, but I think in what we've seen and how they value and how they want to spend their money, I definitely say the Gen Z are the group that will do that. Yeah.
so it's not a comment, or an observation. So when I came in, I saw that you have this slide up on how they spend free, they get the money. And I think that's a symptom of high inflation and realizing that they are not going to be able to save faster than the inflation. And that's a symptom of central bank exclusionary system that we're living, and the rest spending. So I would say that like, and that fits in with their moving jobs more often as well, because if they're not making enough money to just get by, like why would I put up with a shitty job that I don't like?
Mm-hmm.
That I can't, I'm poor anyway, so might as well be poor.
have fun doing it.
So I think that explains those three data points. Um, and the question would be more, well, how do we get out of that? Like, how do we stop the central bank from losing our money and our spending power? And because like I've got raises in a long time, right? Like certainly, you know, they say that inflation is only 4% or 3%, or it's low and stable. But when I look at gas prices 5 years ago, they were like 98 cents, 95 cents a liter. Yesterday, $1.17, 29
Mm-hmm.
at the Shell.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, don't give me, like, I know you're not saying that, but, don't
Not Bank of Canada.
the idea that, like, you know, inflation is low and stable.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, even me, like, I'm not a Gen Z, but I have changed my whole thing. Like, I've been a national saver my whole life. And so it's unusual for me, but I keep $400 in the bank. Like, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't trust the bank.
Thank you for that. No, it's okay. And it's, yeah, and I think it's a fair point that, it might not be a generational movement or value system that they have. It could be a reflection of the times that they are growing up in and the time that they're an active consumer and purchaser of products and needing to have those kind of, like you were mentioning about the bank situations or like accounts and such. I mentioned earlier that they do have a distrust in financial institutions. They're a generation that's using different forms of saving opportunities that just we haven't had before. I remember when it was 2021, it could have been, that when we were presented this about how doom and gloom it was with this generation, that they didn't trust anyone. The banks were really struggling because they came to us and they're like, well, what do we do to educate them? What do we do to get them into our branches? What do we have to do to get their business? And I think that at the time, we didn't really know what to say because it was just this change that we hadn't really seen before. And I don't know if we'll be able to say with certainty for a few years now about if this is all this distrust in the way that they're spending and the way that they think about money and life projections is a generational change is what we're seeing in this very moment, or if it is that, if it's because it's due to the economic climate that they're currently situated in. But definitely in probably 2 to 4 years, when we keep obviously tracking some of these perceptions and situations, we'll be able to know. I think it's personally maybe a little bit of both. I think that obviously they are reacting to the situations before them, but I do think that there has been a big shift in the younger generations in terms of what they value and want out of life compared to what the older generations typically did and do. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or more cynical and more, yeah. So it's definitely, when it comes to the distrust and the cynicism, males will be generally a little bit more, if not significantly more so in some perceptions than females. Whereas when it comes to gender inequalities, agreement in inequality issues as a whole, females tend to be more so than males in favor of the changes that are necessary to resolve those. And females are more likely to feel that those equalities still exist and are significant issues for the society than males, which is pretty stereotypical, I think, and generally what we see as a whole. And it's predominantly strong, that gender difference, obviously here in Alberta compared to other areas of the province or other areas of the country. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we haven't run this anywhere else or actually done that comparison to see if there's similar research out there or questions. And we actually don't have it for enough in even the States to compare if this is a Canadian mentality or if we're seeing it in other areas. But if we had the opportunity to do so, I think that would be a really interesting add to this. Because what we're seeing and why we started doing the youth study is we have found that the common thread between values and perceptions is most strongly correlated to age over anything else. So over gender, over where you are regionally, where you live, it all came down to gender, which is what brought on the youth study as a whole. Is so if age is the common thread that, where the common areas are, where we most commonly see common values and perspectives, well, let's figure out these really young ones and do it on that. So I would assume that the age would be fairly consistent in other areas based on that notion. Whether I can conclude that, I can't, but that would be my guess. Yeah.
Just a short comment on the earlier comment. Everybody's happy that our inflation is down to 1.6%, but that doesn't erase 3 or 4 years of 6 or 8 or 10%, whatever it's been. Gas prices, I don't know what they are.
Yeah, and it's going to take, as I mentioned, it'll take 2 to 4 years of more questions and more research to really understand if, as you were alluding to, like, is it the environment or is it the actual value perception of the generation?
Well, it's also has to do with the perception of the future, right? Like when it showed 68% of people said that they're having a hard time, they're gonna have less than their parents.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the only reason I say it is because I think I'm gonna be able to do something with it in the future. And if I can't find a wife and I don't have any kids and my job sucks,
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, I have to compete with literally millions of foreigners coming into, by the government. Like, what am I doing this for?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't I just go to the national park and hang out with you?
Yeah, and that's the sentiment that
Exactly.
brings on the feelings, yeah.
So I think it's an overall, like, zeitgeist of the times caused by the central bank and their ways they steal money from us. And it's like the Weimar problem,
Mm-hmm.
like 1920 Germany all over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So earlier this morning, developer discussed, like, and answered the question of more immigration, what kind of changes in their demands for housing products. And it was noted that they are more interested in one bedroom or bachelor.
Mm-hmm.
Feelings, like downtown development. I was wondering if you guys have ever looked at, like, confirming that was true, like their income preferences,
Mm-hmm.
or also, like, with you, what are their housing characteristic preferences? Because I worry, and I think there is a majority in terms of, like, the American dream,
Mm-hmm.
single attached house, that has impacts on how we grow the city with long-term financial issues. But I do believe that there is a possibly growing minority out there who are interested in living a more urban life,
Mm-hmm.
but they're looking for a specific product that's not being delivered right now by the market. And so I was just wondering if there's any data out there.
I don't have anything, and I really wish I did. That was one, at Leger, we do a lot of syndicated studies. And that exact topic of housing needs and development opportunities has come up a lot. But we just haven't been able to have a partner group to go down that road together and do. I think it would be a really interesting conversation to have. I think that it's a very difficult situation for developers to be in because I don't think we know, like, I don't know, we've never done it. But if anybody wants to do it, we're more than happy to. And I just think back to some of the work we have done with developers where they test different ideas, and I can't recall the results off the top of my head. But it was a couple of years ago when we were even talking about the zero line development, like the really small, kind of skinnier houses, and zero lot line, I think it was. So there's a lot of options out there, and I don't envy it. But if there's other people that you know of that who would want to explore that, pass along my contact.
Well, I was curious if this letter, like, approach government, like, for example, in the federal government, if they're mandated, like, high density, with
Mm-hmm.
transportation, maybe it would be in their best interest to understand and some of the on that too, because if they're going to mandate it, then look at the markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you guys ever approach the government, or is it more just that you are the consultants?
Yeah. So they'll come to us if they have the need, and there's always a process to that. But what you're mentioning is what we hear a lot when we do public engagement is always engage with citizens and residents very early in the process, because if you don't, and you're doing it retroactively, or you're going ahead and presenting something and testing something without understanding what the actual needs and wants are, it generally will blow up in their face. So as of yet, no, there hasn't. Do I wish there was? Most definitely. Okay, I will let you know. Anything else?
the younger generation. So having some nutritional background, and a lot of the younger generation is more so into, have you done anything about their meal planning and what they eat? Is that anything you can study?
No, not with us personally, like behaviors. But I would assume that obviously that would factor strongly into what their situations are and what their mental states are and how that is all impacted. Because I do think that they have a very different consumption, as they consume everything differently than generations before, and I would even go as far as, diets as well.
Yeah, because typically, the older generation, they had they didn't have access to a lot of processed foods, and I don't think a lot of people realize that serotonin is made in the gut as a result of eating fiber. Like 95% of your serotonin is made in your gut.
Yeah.
So that has a direct correlation to the amount of depression and anxiety that we're seeing. So
I'm sure there is a study out there on that. Yeah, yeah. But, all right. Anything? Fine. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.